All right. Good morning, everyone. I would like to call to order the meeting for our task force to study transparency standards for states' attorneys. I am Senator Charles Sidnor, one of the chairs for this committee, along with Delegate David Moon, who is the House Chair. Uh, we've had a number of very good briefings leading up to this meeting. So today, we're going to discuss some of the proposed recommendations that both I and Delegate Moon, we had an opportunity to discuss for discussion purposes. You all should have received those recommendations prior to the holiday. And so we want to take the time today just to kind of talk through those, uh, uh, and additionally get some feedback from you all and see if there's some consensus that we can build, whether there's some other proposed recommendations that you even wanted to offer. With that before, and I see your hand, uh, Mr. Gibson. And actually, that's probably going to be the best way to operate today. Is you have comments and things, please put up your hands and your electronic hands, and whether it's me or Delegate Moon who will call on you, we will certainly recognize you. Delegate Moon, did you want to share anything today?
Sure, Senator. And good morning, everybody. So I just maybe is this a good time to just try and frame some of the top line recommendations? Okay. So
I,
it looks like
I,
you want
I never got the recommendations. I don't see them. I'm
ah
look,
here I'll tell you what. I will email you right now.
thank
Uh,
you.
yep. So let me give a little bit of context to
If we
these.
can, before did anyone else not receive, or did everyone receive the recommendation? All right, thank you. All right, sorry, Delegate Moon.
Yep. So let me and actually, Chris, would you mind sending the recommend proposed recommendations to Mr. Gibson? I will forward them to you right now so that you can do that. All right, sorry. So I'll read out these. This is very basic stuff anyway, so you'll catch the drift here as I explain it. But we have attempted to take the conversation from the last few sessions we've had together and come up with a consensus. What we hope is a consensus set of recommendations. We can talk about this, whether we want to add, delete, or beef up, or add detail to any of this. But the bottom line is, we thought it would be getting a little ahead of ourselves to get too far into publication and specifying exactly what data points are collected for a robust, prosecutor data project. And instead, it is occurring to us that the technology and standardization is not as far along as one would like to make all of those hopes and dreams easily achievable at the moment. And likewise, that this entire enterprise doesn't make sense unless we have buy-in from the state's attorneys' offices in implementing this. So you will see that the recommendations are heavily about technology modernization and procurement, really, and ways that the state and assembly can help put all of our local state's attorneys' offices onto a modern case management system. And to the extent we are recommending data collection and things of that matter, what we're really going to recommend is a uniformity in at least some aspects of data collection for the things that are already collected: address, race, age, gender, things like that. Converting things to drop downs and radio buttons where possible in order to standardize data collection. And then a lot of the rest of this is about setting up a framework for funding and how we incentivize one-time setup costs for offices that want to upgrade or patch their existing case management systems to do additional things. And then there will be maybe a future conversation about whether we should actually look at expansive data points and things of that nature. But that's where we are today. As the senator has been saying, let's see if we can walk before we run. And again, I think this will hopefully put some minds at ease for how we did this. And so, Mr. Gibson, I don't know if you have the recommendations in front of you yet, but I will just read them actually for the benefit of the public that may not be able to see them. But the draft recommendations are: 1, use of a case management systems by all counties statewide. And then specifically on that, we'd like to explore what we need to do to make the data between the different vendor systems interoperable so that they can turn into a statewide data sheet or otherwise talk to one another. And we'd like to outline what the minimum necessary features for recommended case management systems are that we'd like to see used in the state. So that's a pretty basic recommendation. Get off paper, get onto a case management system, and let's try and make sure our systems talk to one another. The second key recommendation is to try and get us to a place of statewide uniform data collection. So again, it's been mentioned by the various offices that some of the very basic data, as I described, basic demographic data for the defendant and maybe the victim, is housed in narrative text boxes where people are typing in information, and that is not easily translatable to a data sheet so that we can line things up at a statewide level. So we have a draft basic recommendation to try and use drop downs and radio buttons for demographic and location information. Again, for the purposes of trying to get us in position for uniform data collection. The rest of this, we said a future body should look at expanding what data points are uniformly collected. And of course, there would need to be some training and best practices to facilitate even some very basic data collection. The third point recommendation is to try and come up with a funding mechanism to get one-time setup costs defrayed for case management systems. And to be clear, we were talking about one-time setup costs, not necessarily having the state pay for ongoing operations. I think that's just how we've seen it done in other contexts, like our pretrial services grant fund. And so hopefully we can get a fund set up with some match or some other element that would incentivize modernization for offices that would like to use a modern case management system. And then point 4, we are thinking not to get too far into publication and data dashboards and things of that nature, since it seems like there's enough discussion to be had again on just the technology itself and how and what data is being gathered. So all we said here is some manner of data publication or release to be decided locally, and that a future body could look at funding county level data analysts or a statewide data analysts who would have access to, again, the easily existing data, maybe not just from the prosecutors, but also looking at data from the courts and the Sentencing Commission to come out with useful insights as to law enforcement functions in the state. I'll put a little sidebar here. This whole question about funding and data analysts eventually led multiple people to look in the direction of GOCAP. I don't think that's what they're called anymore, but what was the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, both in terms of their existing data analysts that they have for various tasks. If we're looking at a statewide data analyst without extra work on the other offices, or in terms of administering a grant fund, possibly to help state's attorney's offices along. And lastly, we anticipate including an appendix, which would include information about where the various state's attorney's offices are currently in terms of which vendors they use, or whether they use a case management system at all, along with some clips from existing state laws on prosecutor data collection and publication. And lastly, what data points are gathered in other states with regard to prosecutorial data collection. So, to summarize, 1, use case management systems statewide in all counties. 2, set up a statewide uniform data collection procedure for at least for very basic data. 3, get a fund set up to defray case management system costs for the various counties. 4, recommend that some data publication to be decided locally is recommended. And then 5, include a large summary of information for the future. That is it at the moment.
All right. Thank you, Delegate Moon. Mr. Gibson, floor is yours.
No, thank you. I think the proposals aren't unreasonable at all. I think that provided the funding is there, let me lower my hand, sorry. Provided the funding is there to ensure that we have the proper case management systems, and provided the funding is there for the modification of our case management systems to allow them to communicate in a way that you all are describing, as a task force, I say you all, but I'm part of it, we all are describing. I think that those recommendations aren't unreasonable. It's a question of whether we have the resources to actually implement it. But as long as we have those resources, I don't see it as problematic or interfering with our core function or the voice of the people in the community or anything like that. So just a matter of funding, but they seem very reasonable.
Thank you very much. Mr. McKesson. Good morning.
Hello. Good morning. So the recommendations generally make sense to me. My push should be that it would be a real missed opportunity to not put some stake in the ground around what data is collected for 2 big reasons. One is that, I think about when I was a chief human capital in the school system in Baltimore, I had to build our case management system. I don't know how I would build a system without knowing what data to collect. That seems like the floor, at least. So putting out a recommendation, encouraging people to do a case management system and only suggesting demographic data, I don't think is the spirit of why we all are here. And while I understand the hesitation about putting stakes in the ground around some data, I'm also reminded that this is not a law, that we are offering a set of recommendations, and that we heard a range of presentations that do equip us to say, charges, pending charges, drop charge. Like, I think we should put some stake in the ground. And if not a stake in the ground, at least an accounting of the discussion that we had that frames out, here are different data points. Like, I think, I don't know, I am struggling with the idea that the strongest recommendation we make is that everybody should collect data that is not on paper, which is essentially the strongest recommendation offered. So that's like one. The second thing is that, I do think that while I understand the limitations currently that exist with the state's attorney's office, both as somebody who had to do this in a $1 billion organization in the city of Baltimore, I also think that we should be pushing people to think really creatively about how they, I think that our recommendation should not be tempered by the current reality of the limitations of what they do put out. I think we should understand them. I don't think that should limit our imagination about the data that should be transparent. Those are my 2 offerings.
So if I may ask, within recommendation number 2, it talks about the drop down and radio buttons, basic demographic information, but even in B, where it talks about a future body looking at expanding which data points are uniformly collected, I don't think that the opportunity is necessarily foreclosed upon about saying which of those data points are uniformly collected. I'm curious, what other types of data points would you suggest should be included?
Oh, I think there's a whole range of things. I think that the floor should be, you know, charges filed, cases dismissed. I think that there has to be some floor. Like, I don't know what it means to build a case management system without saying what is in the cases other than demographics. Like, that feels, I don't know. That doesn't feel like it makes much sense, because what does the demographic information even mean not attached to inputs or outcomes? Either one of them. Like, I just don't know how we use it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think about the school system. What would it mean to build a database around employees where I only know their age, gender, and race? I don't know anything they do. I don't know how many kids they like. So, I'm open, but I would say like charges filed, dismissed, officers involved. Like, I think there's a huge range, but I would advocate at the basic that we put some floor, or at least a discussion that highlights a range of, we heard presentation from a lot of people, and we say, the most common things collected are like some sort of offering, so people can read this and at least learn from it as they think about what comes next.
Right. Which and I see you, Ms. Sahif. If I could ask Mr. Gibson, and thank you for helping us to gather the information about case management systems. Is there a way that the MSAA can help us to understand which data it is that those who use these case management systems are collecting, so that we could have a floor to kind of see what is collected across the state?
So I hope I guess we didn't talk about this piece of it. The MSAA is one person, Steve Kroll, our executive director, right? And an assistant who assist him, and the president, myself, but my actual job is running, the office of this attorney for Howard County. So that's like a additional thing that I am taking on voluntarily, right? And so the MSAA is very, how do I put it, limited in terms of its capability to do some of the things described, because they don't have the resources or the capacity. It's literally two people right now, and myself as president. And then the body of the MSAA is the elected state attorneys, the Attorney General for the state of Maryland, the U.S. Attorney for the state of Maryland, and I'm missing one, state prosecutor, right? That's the body that actually comes together, meets, talks, discusses, discerns, plans. But in terms of actual like administrative functioning and driving agendas related to the task force, it's two people: Steve Kroll, who's phenomenal, and Judy Arrington, who's also phenomenal. But that's it.
Understand. But what I'm asking is, would they be able to help us to reach out to all of the state's attorney's offices and provide us that foundational information? And mind you, and it's my understanding that under section 15302 of the criminal procedure, the state's attorney coordinator, the law says, shall, with the approval of the state's, with the council, establish and implement uniform reporting procedures for the state's attorneys and professional staff of the state's attorneys to maintain and provide statistical data and information relating to prosecutorial functions and standards of the Office of State's Attorney. So what I'm asking is, I think, well within the statutory requirements of that coordinator's authority.
So I think, again, there's, first of all, the coordinator does do that, and I believe he supplied the chairs with a listing of the things that are done consistent with that statute. However, I'm just pointing out that the resources are limited related to how much they can do, because they only have a limited amount of funding and a limited amount of personnel related to it. Can they reach out to the elected attorneys? Of course. We all get together, and as I said, we meet monthly. All the electeds meet monthly. And I think that, there could be a discussion about what is or is not collected at those monthly meetings. I just want to make sure that you understand the entity you're tasking with tackling this is two people.
Ms. Sahif.
Thanks, Senator. So I agree with what Mr. Gibson said at the top. This seems pretty reasonable. Like, I've seen some statutes in other states that are much more exhaustive and have a lot more requirements, and so this seems much more kind of scaled back. I also agree that this will work with the community. Just to remind again, communities right now have no idea. It's very difficult to know what's happening in their state's attorney's offices. So this is definitely a step in the right direction to letting them know what is actually happening in my state's attorney's office. Are they doing what they said? Who do I want to vote for in elections, etc. I do also agree with Mr. McKesson's point that absent knowing what you're aiming for, what are those requirements that you're going to have to collect and publish out? It's hard to even know when you're building a case management system, and you can get the Cadillac version, maybe I should say the Tesla version, whatever the right thing is, that has all the menu drop downs, or something less. And the vendors are, they're incentivized and pushing you to collect as much as you want. But absent knowing what you have to aim towards, it's kind of hard to know even like which drop downs do I need. So not only do I think so adding more contour now will help in the future. Also, I defer to, Senator Sidnora and Delegate Moon and others, but I watched this bill come through and then it didn't happen. And then the task force and then all these amazing presentations, all this energy momentum, it forced me even to go and look at best practices. So there's a lot of energy and expertise and momentum right now. So I think to Mr. McKesson's point too, are you going to recreate this whole wheel when some other emergencies happening? This is a time of scrutiny when maybe this is the best time for this collection of groups of folks to put more contour on this. And I don't know if we should share screen because I do agree maybe the public wants to see this, but under 2C, I just really appreciate that it says training best practices to facilitate this data collection as part of this, because I've heard repeatedly that absent training and some auditing to make sure people are entering it correctly, you're going to have, what some people say, garbage in, garbage out. So that's great that it's there. And then if I could, I'm going to try to share screen if I could, just to...
Claire, is she able to share her screen?
It looks like I could. I just...
Okay.
Not kind of letting me show the screen I want. Okay, here we go. Yeah. So there's a number of other presentations. I think Claire has helpfully collected all the presentations. But when I went and looked at a bunch of reports and best practices, this is again what they say to report on at the lowest, the base level, to give people contour. So total case numbers, charges at arrests from the police, final charges that the state's attorney decides to bring, cases declined, not charged in the first place, cases dismissed some later point in the life cycle of the case. It could be after the person was arraigned, after the person received discovery, case resolved by pre and trial. So this is on the volume. And then on each individual case, this is also what best practices kind of say out there. So offense type, if it's a misdemeanor or felony, which police agency or other law enforcement agency brought the charge, assigned prosecutor, and I don't think that's meant in some scary tracking way. It's just to help also find the case files later. Some of this involves getting data and then going to case files, and it helps you to find out where to get it from. Indeed, sometimes the case management system lists assigned prosecutor and the case goes to someone else. So, and then some of these characteristics around the person charged and the person victimized. So if we were thinking of adding something, I would recommend something, us looking at those two slides and perhaps others. Thanks.
Appreciate that.
And can I ask, can you send those along to the task force via email, so that maybe folks can respond to things in writing as we zero in on actual recommendation text?
Sure thing.
The comments about what was just seen on the screen. Mr. Love.
Good morning. Appreciate the conversation that's been had so far. I just want to say for the record, and I imagine for a lot of people on this call, this won't be news. But I just want to say for the record that when I think about my vantage point and being on this task force and addressing the way that prosecution has contributed to mass incarceration, one key aspect of that has been the plea bargain and the extent to which, many of the cases that are adjudicated by plea. And so to the extent that there is, and I know from the previous presentation that there's already some mechanism for the public to retrieve information about how pleas are done. As we think about drilling down to more specific kinds of data, I just think information about the way that the offers that are given, information about more public information about best practices. I think those things to me are most important in thinking about the impact the prosecution has on mass incarceration. So I just wanted to state that for the record as something that if we're thinking about that, that's something that has to be central to the information. Because again, I think for a lot of people, it can be rather abstract in terms of thinking about what's driving both the plea deals and how it impacts the different approaches to public safety. So I just want to say that for the record. And as we think about data to drill down into, that the plea bargain piece to me is of utmost importance.
Thank you. Dr. Soleil, did you want to, I know during your presentation, you had a list within your presentation as far as certain data points and things.
Yeah, I thought that the points that Mona presented, I think, are good. I mean, I think that kind of gets at a minimum standard. I like this approach that has been outlined by the co-chairs. I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of start from the ground up. We've had a lot of presentations and talked about various measures and way we may collect specific data points. And I think it would be a smart approach for us to focus on improving from the bottom up how we are collecting this data. And, with 24 different jurisdictions and, we hear one or two don't even have case management systems, I think it makes a lot of sense that this approach is focusing on saying every office needs to have a modern case management system that is designed for data sharing, as opposed to, and it makes a lot of sense why prosecutors would have done this, that they weren't designed for sharing data out of their office. It was designed, for a lot of the data to be in text format and narrative format, and that totally makes sense for their own individual purposes. So I think it just makes sense that for this task force, the primary recommendation to be focusing on modern case management systems that have all the things that Delegate Moon laid out. And I would think, and I guess I would hope that we could maybe that this board could agree on some, of the most basic data points that that should be included in those case management systems. And I think the ones that Mona laid out, I'm trying to remember if I had anything that was uniquely different than that. I don't think I particularly did. I think those are the basic data points, and I don't think there would be. I guess it would depend on if it would be reported out but that's probably maybe the next board could figure that out if it's done at the individual level or the aggregate level. Because if you're just talking about total number of cases that are dismissed or dropped, or are we talking about being able to provide that data at the individual level? That is probably a big distinction. I mean, one of the problem is that charges that are dismissed are now shielded, right? So from the judiciary case search. And so that is something this board would have to think about if you're going to, whether we're public. I don't know that we could propose publicly, sharing cases for individuals that have been, for charges that have been dismissed.
Thank you. Mr. McKesson.
I'll just say this briefly, is that when I think about our task, I do think about this overarching question of what data should be public, what data is important and helpful that can equip communities and other partners to think about transparency and accountability and safety a little more robustly. I will just say that while I understand the limitations that currently exist in prosecutors' offices, I do not think our task is to frame our recommendations around the current limitations. I do not. I think that our task is to be imaginative and bold about what people deserve and what information would help people. And I want to just say, as a declarative sentence, that I worry that people are indexing really heavily to the current limitations as an overarching factor of what we recommend. That worries me and does not meet the spirit of why I think we assembled.
Oh, let's do this then. I don't hear much pushback with regards to the framework. So if we could go maybe recommendation by recommendation, let's use the recommendations as the bones, and let's have some conversation, which will be the flesh for each of them. And I hear you all, and I don't necessarily disagree at all. But I would like to see where we can find some consensus around the data points. My suspicion will be that's where most of the conversation is going to happen. Which from my thinking, I think that falls under proposed recommendation number 2. So we can go through point by point. When we get to number 2, if Mona would not mind maybe sharing the 2 PowerPoint slides that she had, we can talk about those points and we can see what kind of discussion that brings forth, and then keep going. Is that all right? All right. So number 1 was use of case management system by all counties statewide. Interoperability of data between these county systems, minimum necessary features of CMS. Then again, I guess some of the data could fall under that minimum necessary features of CMS. Is that what you were when Delegate Moon, when you and I were talking about this, the data points being collected, were you looking at it under 1 or on 2?
I think it's probably under 2.
Okay. All right.
I guess there's a question under number 1, whether we need to specify minimum features of the CMS that we would like included as the recommended type. I think this is one where the practitioners would know more about how specific we need to be on this point. It sounds like the 3 predominantly used vendors cover the needs as anticipated, but without saying exactly what those needs are, it's a little vague, I would say. But if there's not going to be controversy on this point either, we can move on to number 2 and deal with number 1 in writing after the meeting. Mr. Gibson.
So number 1's cost is going to vary depending upon what data you wish to obtain, right? And so the case, as already was discussed, the case management systems that we have are not designed towards this goal. And so there's a cost to shift the goal from, our narrative-driven, responding to the community and internal management-based information collection to an outward-facing radio button selecting, like binary, to make it easier for them to kind of categorize and catalog process, right? So depending upon what data you want to collect, that's going to impact the cost of the features employed by each case management system. I'm just going to call it CMS for short, for each CMS, right? And ensuring the cost assuring integration of the varying case management systems. And again, you know, a number of us have PBK, a number of us have JD, right? But we don't all have the same PBK and we don't all have the same JD. And so there will be a fiscal cost associated with creating uniformity, creating the process, and then, as Mona mentioned, like the training of the people to move from what they have historically done to this new way of categorizing and processing that doesn't interfere with our actual running of our office as well.
So can I just clarify here, for the purposes of drafting a recommendation, will it be sufficient to say that the feature we seek is the interoperability of the data and the ability to gather and produce the common data points that we're about to try and get consensus around?
Yeah, so Delegate Moon, I think that as it's phrased is fine. As you phrased just now is fine. Just understand that the amount of money associated with it, what is phrased, the framework you've created is fine. The amount of money associated with it is the variable.
Got it. Okay, well, Senator, this feels to me like we can move off of point one and try to beef that up in writing after the meeting, and then focus the discussion on number two, since it sounds like that's the bigger variable at this point.
Right. Assume, Ms. Mona.
Okay, sorry, before I move off it, if interoperability means that the systems need to be able to speak to each other, I don't personally know that that's necessary. They all need to be able to output the same information.
The data, I think we're thinking about the interoperability of the data itself, not the systems.
Great, as long as that's clear. Thanks.
Thank you. And welcome, Ms. Warnkin. So consensus number one, no, everybody's all right. I'm not seeing any hands go up. So good for number one. Let's move to number two. Statewide uniform data collection procedure. A, drop downs and radio buttons for very basic demographic / location information. B, future bodies should look at expanding which data points are uniformly collected. C, training best practices to facilitate this data collection. Mona, would you mind please sharing your screen again with those data points?
And I guess, Senator, I would look at this as a question to this body. Are folks comfortable with us taking the concept of having minimum demographic data and adding in some of this other information into the recommendation, again, to try and get us around a floor of information to be gathered as we move forward? Particularly curious about the state's attorneys on this question.
I have expressed during my presentation pause about how the data collected can be used to undermine the ultimate goal of justice. I think that some of this information could be used that way. And so I don't want to drag out this task force or meeting. I've already expressed concerns about undermining our primary goal of justice and corrupting, not just undermining, but corrupting the primary goal of seeking a just outcome by making it almost like a pedagogical, almost like a school-like setting where you're chasing a grade. I think it's very, very dangerous to create an environment where prosecutors are incentivized to chase a particular number so they look good or are perceived positively versus doing what is right in each instance on a case-by-case basis. And I think that some of this information could be twisted in that way. And so I don't want to belabor it any more than that.
But with your expertise, and again, we have 7 data points on the screen, are there specific ones of these that are on the screen that you believe state's attorneys would have problems with?
So, for instance, I believe that final charges could be twisted, right? The right out, you might charge something initially when you have the case comes in with a whole bunch of things, and you might resolve it to count 3, right? Someone can say, "Oh, you didn't go off the top count," right? And make that a argument, whereas count 3 might have been the right thing to do based upon a holistic view of the case, right? So I think that could be twisted. Cases declined, cases dismissed. Again, why are they dismissed? Why are they declined? Right? The why is very, very critical in gauging whether justice was achieved. But in a radio box of, there were 20 cases dismissed, or there were 100 cases dismissed, or whatever, right? That doesn't speak to why they were dismissed. Were they dismissed because there were federal charges? Were they dismissed because they shouldn't have been charged at all, and we finally realized that we had the wrong person? Was it dismissed because X, Y, or Z? And so, there's a whole bunch of why that doesn't get captured and can get twisted. And I'll add further that as I said in my presentation, the explanation is lost, right? People just glom onto X fact, and the long narrative explaining why that is lost in the sauce. And I think that is a potential danger for corrupting our underlying purpose of seeking justice. I could debate others, but those two are easy. I mean, I don't want to go. I want to make this as functional for a discussion amongst many people. So I'm not going to try to monopolize the time. Those are just examples of the issues I see. I already presented as to what I saw, and I already presented as to the danger in undermining or corrupting the process.
Ms. Mona, you said that these were data points that were found in looking at best practices. I'm assuming across the country, correct?
Yes. While I can understand some of Mr. Gibson's fears, I haven't seen them borne out anywhere. Honestly, there's a huge assumption to what he says, that currently what's happening in the system is completely uncorrupt and fair and equitable. Like, that's really what's motivating a lot of this, is people want to better understand what's happening in their state's attorney's offices. Now, the issue I've seen state's attorneys bring up is making sure that no one is identified as a victim, right? And that's a concern. So here we're going to be talking about collecting all this data at the aggregate level, so in large numbers. But on the second slide, we have victim characteristics. And so what I have seen some state's attorneys concerned about, and there's ways around this, but collecting is one thing, and then what you publish is second. Let's say there's only 2 sex assaults that occur in a certain zip code, right? And providing the race and the zip code there, it could be identifying of a person in a certain way, where depending on the volume. And so I think when you're publishing victim data in the aggregate, if the numbers aren't large, you need to be very thoughtful whether you publish them or not. But collecting them doesn't necessarily mean publishing them. So I think the concern I've seen state's attorneys raise is not wanting this aggregate level data, where it tends to be very small or in only a particular zip codes, accidentally identify somebody. So that's what I found, Senator Sidner. I hope that answered the question.
No, and that's a good distinction, collection versus publication. And I think, again, the title of this particular proposed recommendation is statewide uniform data collection procedures. So I don't know if, and I'll Mr. Gibson, if you wouldn't mind thinking about that, I'm curious. Collection versus.
That's a very valid point, Senator Sidnor, right? The collection of the information is different than the publication of the information. So a lot of the information. Well, I'll stop there. Yes, you're very valid point. Very valid.
All right. Dr. Soule.
I'm hesitant to add to the list. I think Mona's list is right on point. I would think that I went back and wanted to just double check with what I previously presented. I think the one other key variable would be that would go right on along in this, like number 8 would be whether diversion is offered. And I think that's pretty straightforward. It's other research has shown that that can be a point of disparity. And so I think that would be something that would be important to include.
All right, thank you. The floor is this task force. Are there any other comments, questions, concerns? Mr. McKesson, does this get to what it was that you were hoping to get out of this task force?
Yeah, I think this makes sense. Thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. And I don't know. I guess you and Delegate Moon will craft the narrative around this. But I am reminded about a question you asked 2 meetings ago for the data collection policies from the State's Attorney's Office, and that you repeated today. And one of the things that became clear when you asked those questions, both 2 meetings ago and when you brought it up today, is that we are beholden to the insert here of this current state's attorneys to know anything about what happens, whether it's their resources or the disposition or the temperament or the election cycle. We are completely beholden to them to know nuances, and these recommendations get us closer to not only being beholden to those people.
Gotcha. Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
I want to make sure that the record's clear, right? So policies are discussed during election cycles, right? The policies that the state's attorney is going to enact, people vote on those and decide who they want to support, right? The actual end results of the cases are public. The entire process, as was covered in the first presentation, is public, right? Like the offer that's made is put on a public record. It's made in open court, right? The defendant chooses to accept that or not in open court. There's a litany the defendant goes through in open court, in a public record, right? Where he's either video and or audio recorded, typically audio recorded, in saying what they acknowledge, what their choice is, right? The sentencing guideline forms, which are what the pleas are based upon, all the 24 jurisdictions use the sentencing guideline forms in crafting and drafting their pleas. So the pleas fall within the window. Remember, I kind of put a presentation, I gave you a grid. There was a grid that showed you like an X and Y axis. That process is public, right? Like there's a public record created related to that. And so I just want to make sure it's not the argument that the state's attorneys are operating in a vacuum or that the information isn't publicly shared. There is information that's not publicly shared, right? But the policies, again, we run on, so that's the basis of the voters in our community voting on us, right? Is the policies, what we stand for, what we believe in, what we want to do with the office, the direction we want to take the office. Those policies are articulated over and over again at community forums, all throughout the jurisdictions we're in, so that voters are informed when they vote, right? Unless the argument is the voters are just voting blindly, which I don't think is an argument that anyone, Senator Sidnor and Delegate Moon would ever make, because those same voters are voting for them, right? I don't think they're voting blindly for A and not blindly for B. I think they are informed of the policies we stand by, and the actual process of the plea, again, is put on the record. The data points in how that plea is crafted are part of a form that's created and provided to the courts and the Sentencing Commission. And so I just want to make sure that it's clear that the system is not solely reliant on prosecutors articulating these things, that there are other entities that are that are working together to share and make public the process.
Well, I do think you would agree that when voters are going into the voters' boxes, there's a lot more information about the jobs that me and Delegate Moon do by looking at our votes and looking at our constituent services. So there's a whole lot more that's there, and I understand many things are happening um, in the courtroom that is publicly available. Uh, but this has been one of the blind spots of our entire criminal justice system. People have a better idea and a better sense of what happens with police. We now have body cameras, so now you're seeing police do what they do on video. Just a few years ago, there was efforts made by many of my colleagues to open up things with the court. The court system has its case management system that's available for anybody in the general public to go and look at a variety of cases. What prosecutors do is always kind of been, or this whole process of charging and the like has kind of been behind this curtain that many of us, unless you're a part of the system, you're not going to understand. And the voters, what they have to go on is a political figures or candidates statements that they're making during an election time that they're going to be tough on crime. What does a policy of tough on crime look like? Where's the data? A lot of this stuff is anecdotal, but many times we aren't looking at the data. Just yesterday, I believe the Baltimore Banner published an article with all of this conversation going on about juvenile crime. And essentially what the article said is that the data doesn't match with what is being said in this discussion about juveniles committing so much crime. How do you know? You look at what does the data say? Yes, people feel unsafe. Yes, we're seeing things on the news, but what does the data say? Many of me and my colleagues, we pride ourselves on being data-driven legislators. Well, you can't legislate in the dark. So the whole point behind this is to let's bring out the data. Let's see how things are going. Ultimately, as a policymaker, it helps me. Anyway, off my soapbox, Mr. Love, and then Mr. Gibson.
So this is in part a question for Mr. Gibson, just to make sure that I follow clearly, because I'm clear that the sentencing guidelines are public, based on the presentation from, I believe, our first meeting or second meeting, and then the actual pleas that are read in court that is accepted by the defendant. For me, the data that I would be interested in when I think about plea bargains that would be helpful to the public, for instance, is there a record of what was offered to a defendant? So before they accept the plea in court in public, is there public record, or really record anywhere that's accessible to the public, of what was offered to the defendant?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Love. Something just popped on my screen. I have no idea. I can read what someone's writing. Whoever's projecting, probably don't want to share the email you're sending to the universe. So anyway, yeah. So things do move in secret. Anyway, so as I was saying, Mr. Love, the offer that's presented to the defendant is placed on the record in open court. The defendant has the ability to reject and or accept that offer. There are times when that offer changes, and it will change again in open court. So, it could be that the state makes an offer because a witness isn't ready at this moment and where the judge is saying, go to trial right now. And the state might say, look, if you take, I will reduce my offer because the judge is saying go to trial right now, and I'm missing someone I need at this moment. And I'm telling you that, like they convey that. So the offer is going to be lowered in that moment. The defendant can take advantage of that or say, no, I want my trial. State might be able to get the witness there in time, and the defendant might lose that gamble and, at the end of trial, get a heavier sentence because, I made the offer based upon a weakness in my case in that moment that no longer exists. That's one example, right? But
and I'm sorry to interrupt. And I'm asking the question because so much of at least from what I understand, when defendants are having conversation with an ASA, there are lots of conversations that are had about the potential bargain. And I guess I'm trying to understand, like, how is that conversation or how are those series of conversations recorded? Like, I imagine that when the phone call is placed, right, and a conversation is had, that there are nuances of the conversation in terms of what is offered. That I imagine wouldn't take, like, all of that. I don't imagine happens in open court. Like, the process you just laid out makes sense to me, and I feel pretty clear about that. But I imagine there are conversations on the front end before it gets to open court.
So the defendant has a right to privacy with his counsel. He could tell the defendant when he talks to his counsel and says, "Look, I murdered the guy, shot him in the face 5 times. Get me the best deal you can get me." Right? That conversation is private. Or, look, I didn't do it. I never committed this crime. I won't take anything. That conversation between defendant and counsel is private. Counsel will relay to us their client's position as to what they will take. We may make an offer. Defense will often make a counter offer. There may be some.
So that initial offer, that initial offer, that's the front of the conversation from the ASA. My question is, that is public, like the actual offer that is made on the front end, is that part public?
So the offer, it depends. If there's a negotiation between the state and defense that occurs in a private setting, not shared with the universe, and they reach a conclusion as to what the offer will be, that is put on the record, and that's called a binding plea. We hope when the judge will join us, if the judge joins in it, it's a binding plea where the state's made an offer, defense accepted the offer, the court, we hope, accepts the offer, and then all parties agree that it's called an ABA binding plea. Okay, that's one option. There's another option where state makes an offer, defense makes a counter offer, and there isn't agreement, right? The defendant may agree that the state has the evidence to prove the case, but doesn't agree with the state's offer. And that's what's called an open plea, right? It's a plea, but it's I agree I did it. I don't like the number he's giving. I want to ask something different. I'm asking the court to reach a different conclusion. And then the state articulates why they believe that the offer within the guidelines is what they support. The defense articulates why they believe that a lower offer is merited. And the judge then decides where to land between those two positions. Okay. And
I don't want to, I'm sorry, I don't want to belabor. I'm asking the question and I'm putting it out there just for the record that for me, a part of what I'm interested in data that is my understanding that is not available to the public is that very first offer conversation to a defendant about, what it is that the state, what it is the state will offer. And I guess what I'm saying is, to the extent, and understand that there's, confidentiality with clients. So I'm not asking for anything that would breach that. But one of the concerns that I have is thinking about, what are those initial conversations? Since, vast majority of cases are resolved by plea bargains. I would just be curious about ways to make more public the what it is that is being offered in an initial engagement with a defendant and their counsel, because I think that would be helpful in people making determinations about how they're feeling about how their prosecutors are dealing with people that come before them, since the vast majority of them are coming from the plea. So that's the point I'm trying to, that's the point that I'm trying to get across. I don't have a solution. That's why I was asking questions for clarity. But that to me is a very particular concern of mine.
Right. Again, there are times with that initial offer is the offer that's put on the record. That happens very frequently, right? There are times where there's negotiations between the parties. Whatever the final offer is, it's put on the record. That offer can either be rejected or accepted at any point in time by the defendant up until it's actually consummated, where they say, I accept it. There's a plea litany that's gone through. The judge feels comfortable that the defendant understands their rights and is accepting the offer. The state then has to put on the record the basis of that offer, the facts that substantiate the legal connection or nexus to guilt. The judge can still say, no, I don't agree that you've hit your mark, or I do agree, and then the plea is imposed. Okay, that's the process. I raised my hand before, so I just want to.
Yeah, go right on ahead.
Thank you.
And then Ms. Mona and Ms. Warren.
So in terms of the charges that was mentioned, the charges are by law secret. It's a grand jury process. Once the charges are finalized, that's shared publicly and is available currently. But the charges, in terms of like the actual grand jury process, I went through why that's secretive. If someone's accused of an allegation is that they've molested a child or stole from work, if that allegation is no billed, which means the grand jury does not find probable cause to support it, that allegation, if it were shared, is damaging to that individual. And so as a result, that information has to be kept quiet. Also, there are times where investigations are ongoing, and the world finding out about the investigation would be problematic to the overall investigation, the overarching investigation. And so for those reasons, that is by law kept quiet. And like that is a secret process that's been secret since we've had law, basically, in America. The final point I wanted to push back on was related to Senator Sidnor said that you felt that the voters know more about delegates and senators that are running because of their voting positions. Well, they don't know the mechanics that go into creating the vote. They know the votes, but they don't know the mechanics, the discussions, the bartering and selling. How the sausage is made is not shared. It is just what is publicly seen and then a vote, right? For the legislative people. With us, we work directly for our communities. The communities that put us into these positions of power, we work directly for them. The actions we take in our communities directly impact our communities. So we have a very direct, state attorneys have a very direct nexus and connection with the people who put us in this place. It's not with legislative people, it's diffused. It's the entire state. We are directly tied to the people who vote for us. The crimes that happen that we prosecute happen in our jurisdiction. The victims are from our jurisdiction. The defendants are from our jurisdiction. Their families are from our jurisdiction, right? And so I think it's a misnomer to state that the communities who elect state attorneys are doing so in the dark. I just want to make sure that I'm very clear in stating definitively that the people who vote for us have a good, fair, and robust understanding of who we are. I don't think it's fair to say they don't know who we are, what we stand for, and they certainly have seen the impact of our choices if we've been in office already.
All right. Miss Mona, then Miss Heather.
Thank you. So I wanted to make a recommendation to add one more element here, but first to recognize another panelist, task force member's comment. You can collect on plea bargains. And so I think you're kind of asking about what the plea bargaining process is. I agree with you that a lot of it's very much in the dark. I'm a former prosecutor myself, and so I would offer different pleas, and sometimes the plea would change over the course of the case, and not all of the variations of the pleas were necessarily put on the record. Sometimes what prosecutors do as well is say, if you go to trial, I'm going to charge you with a charge that carries a mandatory minimum sentence. So you should take this lesser charge, what some people call coercive plea bargaining. So to say, I agree with you that prosecutors are part of what's driving mass incarceration, and that there's a lack of transparency around the plea bargaining process. I appreciate what Mr. Gibson's saying about the grand jury secrecy process and about the integrity of investigations, but I want to say again, from my experience as a prosecutor and working with prosecutors around the country to put these kind of data transparency measures in place, that's not a concern that's of note, in my opinion, because all of this is aggregate level data, meaning it's high level data in numbers, and it's not going to be associated with particular names. So this doesn't involve grand jury secrecy, and this doesn't involve the integrity of ongoing investigations that have not yet been brought to light. If folks wanted, they could put in a requirement here. So I think it's worth discussing about, and hopefully you can see my screen, plea offers. So a requirement could be in place to tell state's attorneys to enter into their case management system plea offers that are made in the course of a case and to record that. That is an option. What I wanted to recommend, and Mr. Gibson kind of referred to this, but why the case is dismissed is a very interesting thing, and reason for case dismissal, I would propose this task force think about. I'll put it in red to show that it's like not on my original kind of slide. But to say, if the case is dismissed, what I've seen a lot of prosecutors do is look at a bunch of cases that are charged, and then they're seeing a lot of the cases end up being dismissed, or a lot of the cases are charged as felonies and then pled out as misdemeanors, which raises the question of, should these cases be charged as misdemeanors in the first place? The reason they sometimes are charged as felonies instead of misdemeanors is because they're trying to plea bargain someone down and force them to not go to trial because you're trying to save your own office resources and the like. So reason for case dismissal is a drop-down menu, and it can be lack of evidence. It could be superseding case, to Mr. Gibson's point. Maybe the feds are come in and they bring a case, or this defendant has a global plea of some sort. But listing the reason for dismissals also enables you to track kind of what's happening in an office. Or if you saw that a lot of cases that are brought against, let's say, Hispanic people in a certain jurisdiction, if a lot of them are getting dismissed, you might want to explore what's happening there. Sometimes it helps you trace back to a certain police officer or a law enforcement agency that might have problematic issues happening with their cases. So I would offer for discussion for this task force, reason for case dismissal as another data point to collect. Thanks.
Thank you. Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator. We'll start with, because a couple of points now have racked up in the conversation. I'll try to be brief, but I don't want to be a broken record about this one, but I just want to go on record again around kind of the lack of representation of a key perspective here, the public defender perspective, sort of this back and forth about the mechanics of how these processes play out and what the pressure points are and how much of that is in the public domain versus not. I think it's helpful in moments like that if we're not, sort of just relying on a particular perspective of the task force. So I wanted to kind of note that absence once again. Also touching on kind of this back and forth between Mr. Gibson and Senator Sidnor about sort of elections and the information that voters take into account when they're considering who they're voting for state's attorney. It's this idea that sort of the election is about the stated policies or position of the state's attorney. It seems to me that part of why the data is so important, and you already articulated some of this, Senator Sidnor, but so that people actually have the information to discern whether or not the trends and what's going on matches the stated positions, that are being said publicly by the candidate. So I just wanted to underscore from my perspective why that information is so needed in your own words to have a better understanding of the full scope of what's happening, a robust, filled out understanding that's not based on particular cases that may have impacted that individual community member, or that may be on a higher profile based on what sort of coverage it got in the news, but actually have, sort of that full scope. And then I was just very curious, some of your earlier points, Mr. Gibson, for example, about the concerns about whether or not collecting the data and then publishing it. And again, I picked up on that being a really important distinction, but whether doing any of those things run the risk of, as you stated, I think, corrupting or undermining the key goal of justice. And I was just, sort of really curious about your thoughts about whether the absence of collecting and publishing that, comes with those same exact risks, because I think that's, that widespread understanding of that risk is part of what convened this very task force. And just the idea, and again, as you're well situated as someone who is currently serving as a prosecutor, and behind that curtain, the concern about whether or not collecting the data makes people, chase particular numbers or outcomes. And it seems to me that there's already a risk in some places that in the dark or behind the curtain, there may already be those incentives to chase certain outcomes. But by actually making those data points public, there's a broader and more diverse set of eyes sort of weighing in on how the goal of justice actually manifests. And the last point I wanted to raise, and it was a question that you've actually already preempted, Mona, it was for you, was how often, when you added reason for dismissal, that was my exact question, sort of how often nationally are offices that have embraced these data collection practices collecting more information around the why? Because I think, again, Mr. Gibson's point is really important. There's a lot around the why that may or may not be easily captured, and I'm wondering how often that's happening.
Was that a question to Ms. Mona?
Yeah, I mean, you already spoke to it, Mona, when you added in red that additional recommendation, which I very much agree with. So I guess the question would be sort of how often that's happening, especially based on the fact that that list is already a reflection of sort of national trends.
Yeah, I'll be brief just to say, I'd say it's not happening as often, which is why it wasn't on that list. Overall, prosecutors are just really woefully far behind in collecting or publishing any data, because it's, a lot of offices are still in paper and it's expensive. So I'd say most offices are not collecting reason for dismissal, but some offices are, including that I've worked with. And it's wonderful because it gives everybody a lot more transparency, including state's attorneys being able to explain, why cases are being dismissed, and it not looking accidentally like, a lack of effort or attention to cases, being able to explain why. But overall, the 2,300 plus prosecutors' offices most simply don't collect, anything or publish anything.
All right. Before I go to Mr. Gibson and Dr. Soule, there are a number of other members who are here, have not voiced any comments or anything yet. So I wanted to see if you all had a comment or anything about this. If not, I'm more than happy to go ahead to our members with their hands up. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I just go back to, I thought that what the two co-chairs had sent out for a framework of the recommendations was a good base. I thought that was a fair and balanced approach. And I'm not exactly sure we need to add all this additional stuff at this point. I think it was a good point that was made. We need to walk first before we run. And let's get all of the counties collecting the data and get them on some form of a system. And then we can fine tune what that data is. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other comments from any of our task force members who have not spoken yet? All right. Rich and then David.
I'm just going to respond to a series of points that were made. There was mention of by Mona of, when you charge someone with a felony, I'm going to call it a coercive plea. So to charge someone as a felony in order to get them to plead to a misdemeanor, number one, in order to bring felony charges, right, you would have to survive first either an indictment process or a preliminary hearing process whereby either 23 members of the community said, yes, felony charges are warranted, or a judge said, yes, felony charges are warranted based upon these facts and the law. Now, the idea that if they're warranted, right? And you're working out something less. That's not the same thing as I'm charging you with something with the goal of twisting your arm or shoving you towards a particular outcome to save resources, as was stated. That's just not how it works. At least that's not how it works. I've been a prosecutor for 20 years, just about 20 years, in multiple jurisdictions throughout the state of Maryland, and that's not how it works here. I can say that. Related to the comment about the public defenders not being present, Ms. Workin has mentioned that several times. I agree they're not present. I want to be very clear. First and foremost, I view the public defenders as partners. Okay, we are partners in justice. They're not opponents to me. I don't see them that way. I've worked with them my whole career, and we're all seeking justice. Their job is to make sure that we're doing our job and to defend their clients' rights. So I don't see them in any negative light. However, I would state that this is a task force for prosecutorial transparency standards, and I think that because that is what our task is, it makes sense that, honestly, I think there'd be more prosecutors here besides myself, but that there be a prosecutorial mindset in that space, right? If the public defenders were setting up a board that's going to define how their policies are, right, internally, or rules that are going to govern the public defender's office, I highly doubt there'd be many, if any, prosecutors in that space, right? And so I just think that the purpose of this task force has been set up by Senator Sidnor and Delegate Moon. Their voice not being here is not reflective of a desire to push them out or ostracize them, but that's not what this is set up to do, right? And I was making notes. Ms. Workin, you asked about the absence of data collection and it corrupt, and isn't that absence going to corrupt? No. You don't solve a problem by creating the problem, right? If you are creating a scorecard whereby you are incentivizing people's livelihoods to do a certain thing, you're incentivizing a certain behavior, people are going to naturally chase that behavior, right? It's the classroom, right? Students seek A's. From the time they're children to the time they finish college or graduate studies or whatever, they're taught to chase the grade, right? It's ingrained in you to chase the grade, right? And so if you have a set of benchmarks, and I agree that if you're going to track this stuff, the why is very important. Although I think the why will be lost all the same. If you're going to have a set of benchmarks that are just data points, right? There is a great potential, and I hear what Ms. Mona said, but there's a great potential for grade chasing, as already articulated, and that undermines our ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to match the appropriate consequence with the appropriate action, if appropriate to bring charges at all. So should we bring charges is the first question. Did a crime occur? Did this person commit the crime? And then if so, what is the appropriate response to that, right? And that shouldn't be driven by, well, I null pros the case last week. I don't want to null pros this case. Or I didn't get top count yesterday, so I got to get top count today to alter my stats. Even if it's not on the individual level, the prosecutors that work in our offices, I have 92 people that work for me, my staff, they all respond to me. And in the end, if I'm going to be graded upon it, they're graded upon it. So if you're going to disaggregate, disaggregation at a statewide level might be different, but if you're disaggregating to the local level, whether it be individual prosecutors or just county by county, that danger still exists.
All right, David, D-Ray, and then my co-chair.
Sure, I'll be brief. Just following up on the prior conversation between Ms. Warnken and Mona regarding reasons for dismissal. In one of the prior presentations, we did hear about, we could look to Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office in their case management system. They do provide like a drop-down menu of approximately 20 the most common reasons for dismissal. And so that we do have that framework that could potentially be used as a guide.
Thanks for pointing that out. D-Ray?
This is just a quick, I like where we are landing, so I have no pushes around where we're landing. This is just like a point for the record around, I will echo, I didn't echo it last time, but Heather's point around the absence of the public defender's perspective being here is that part of this process and the makeup of the committee has acknowledged that the prosecutor's perspective is not the only perspective, which is why we have Judge Davis on, or former Judge Davis as a member of the committee, because it's an understanding that we should have people who are experts on the process as a part of the process. And that the prosecutor is not the only expert, but is a key member of this. In the same way that when we talk about schools, it's not just teachers, it's principals, it's coaches, right? And I would hate that anybody in this committee thinks that the prosecutor's perspective is the only valuable perspective, and that everybody who is an expert in the process isn't included. So I think Heather's point about the absence of, I mean, we're already down the road, so here we are. But I think the absence of the public defender is notable, and I think it is notable because the makeup of the committee includes the other two key players, prosecutors and judges.
Although I do want to make certain that I'm pointing out the framework for the task force. It was open for our Senate President, our Speaker, and the governor to make appointments. And I think except for the MSAA and others, they're open. And I think Victim Services may have been the other, but point taken. I hear you all.
Yeah, and Heather's push is like, I mean, I haven't talked to Heather about this, but I believe too, this idea that we, like, you know, public defenders didn't come present here. I don't know if I missed.
No, they did not.
Right. So I think that the push that I support is the total absence of the public defender is actually an oversight. I mean, we're here now, but gotcha. I think that is a fair push.
Understand. Delegate.
What you see is the raised hand of a discussion closing. It's been a very fascinating back and forth, and I think it does inform our recommendation crafting, but I do want to steer us back to the recommendation crafting, because in spite of this vigorous conversation, I actually think we're not as far as apart as this conversation would make it seem. And points about the membership here being taken and the possible motives and whatever. Again, we have tried to distill the conversation from both sides' perspective and lay out a series of recommendations which we think will get a consensus, and not have anyone think we're doing something funny here, or have some funny tricks up our sleeves. Again, with the idea that we want all parties to be a partner in implementing this. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's like if you have the state's attorneys in sort of like willful noncompliance or disinterest in modernizing their case management systems, they're the ones that are inputting the data. So I think we want to make sure this system works for everybody and that it's seen as a help. Now, with that being said, we're on recommendation 2 still, which is this question about, all right, so we're going to recommend some uniformity in data collection, and it seems everybody's fine with that, including the very basic demographic information. And so the question for Mr. Gibson and the State's Attorneys Association will be, if we take the additional list that Mona and Mr. Soule are recommending as best practice basic data points, can we include those as a possibility in uniform data collection, provided this information is not disaggregated at this point in time and there's not an anticipation of publication? That again, we're talking about simply servicing the state's attorney's functions, giving them a modern case management system, getting everyone up to very basics on what the various counties are collecting in a uniform manner. And again, we may never get to the business of publishing or getting into data dashboards. And this set of recommendations does not contemplate that. It punts that for a future discussion, and one that for the time being is a local decision to publish something so that there's some transparency, and maybe a statewide GoCap person produces some report for available information. But again, we are not talking about publication at this point, but just for best practices and having a modern statewide system. Can the prosecutors live with including something there? And I'd say you don't need to raise your hand and answer that now, because I think where we're at is we have actually, Mona has kindly put that together in written form for us, sent it around. And I know there were a couple additions she added in red as discussion points from this. And if you wouldn't mind sending those around too, it would be appreciated. So I think everyone should sleep on this aspect of the recommendation. This seems to be where all the discussion is. Where we're at now is not publishing. We're talking about just the data gathering in a uniform manner, and we're talking about including demographic information. And the proposal has been put forth from both government and advocate task force members that we consider including these additional data points, again, just for collection. We can start to build a draft report around what we have here and have sort of a placeholder, one that includes the basic demographic information and one that includes the additional points that were suggested by task force members. And hopefully we can resolve this through discussion and circulation of drafts before the next time we meet. But I do believe we should move on, as I don't think we're going to settle this in the next 5 minutes or so.
Sounds good. Number 3, fund to get one-time CMS setup cost defrayed. Any commentary around that point?
Just that it's essential.
Say it again?
Just that would be essential.
Okay,
None of this happens without funding.
Right.
There has to be money behind it. Unfunded mandates are not going to work. And
right.
So,
and Delegate Moon and I, we've talked about trying to set up a meeting with the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services to see what may be available. It's our understanding that there could be some federal money that may be out there that we could use them as the go-between to help to create some sort of funding mechanism. So our intentions are to look into that. Mr. McKesson, yes, sir.
Yep. So on the funding piece, I think it might be helpful to figure out a time frame for a second amount of funding, maybe that is a little smaller. But I think about, one of the challenges of building CMS is that you build it and then you got to go back at some point to make it better, fix things, or find things. And what I've seen, especially in the realm of education, is that people build these incredible things. And then when they go to tweak it, they have no money because they spent all the money on the front end, which makes sense. So it could be cool to think about there's a funding for the build and then there's a 5-year reflection something like that I don't think people have done well, but it screws us later when we're like, you only built 2 buttons and we really need 3 and you ain't got no money to build 3. So now we're.
Got you. Thank you. I see a thumbs up from Rich. Any other comments? All right. Let's move to number 4. Some manner of data publication release to be decided locally. Future bodies should look at funding county data analysts or a statewide data analyst. Are there any comments about that recommendation? Yes, ma'am. Ms. Mona.
I think that's a place where it would make sense to say these are the data points that should be included at a floor level along the lines of what we've already discussed.
Got you. Any other comments? All right. Recommendation 5 is the appendices. And I believe, I'm not certain if you all have received the list that we have for the counties that have or don't have CMS and the vendors, but that was provided by MSAA. So thank you very much for that. And according to that list, there are, Garrett County does not have a case management system. Talbot County currently doesn't have one, but they're in the process of obtaining PBK. And Queen Anne's has no case management system. So the vast majority of our state's attorney's offices have a system, with the majority of that majority using PBK. The next system, JD, one office using Justware by Journal Tech, and one office using Microsoft Access. So in terms of having a CMS, many of the offices are already there, so which is good to know. The other portion of the appendices would be other state laws on prosecutor data collection and publication. I do believe you all have that. Again, the inclusion of that information again is so that the public knows and can see what it is that's being done across the United States, as well as the data points gathered in other states. Again, just to give us and the public a good sense of what it is, and also speaking to I think the reasonability of the reasonableness of what it is that we're looking to do. Outside of those 5 proposed recommendations, does anybody in this body have any additional recommendations that they would like to bring or speak to for our discussion purposes? Wow. That's pretty good, Delegate Moon, right? All right. Again, and I'd like to give an opportunity to some of our task force members who have been in attendance but have been relatively quiet. Delegate Valentine, did you have anything that you wanted to say? Are you all right?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I did have one question as it pertains to the screen for individual case characteristics, and most of the points on that screen dealt in generalities, except for number 4, which specifically says an assigned prosecutor. And that was a concern to me when we're revealing data. Every other point on there is in general terms, number of charges, and when you deal with prosecutors, especially in the district court, cases get passed off, they change assigned prosecutors repeatedly as it transitions from the district court level to the circuit court level. Individuals get transferred, promoted, cases get reassigned. So I think it would be very difficult to get a good perspective. A lot of times a prosecutor may not be assigned that case until a week before because it's already gone through 3 prosecutors' hands, pleas have been offered, and that was a concern to me, the singling out an individual prosecutor.
Thank you. Miss Linda, did you have anything any perspective that you would like to add as a member from the Attorney Grievance Commission?
No, this has been extremely interesting because we are struggling with our data collection as well, and in discussion with the Supreme Court, excuse me, I was going to say the Court of Appeals. I'll get used to it. About what information they think would be important for the public to know in our annual report and what we report to the court. So I don't have anything to add, just that it's been very educational for me to hear what others are struggling with. So
thank you very much. Miss Miss Amanda, are you there, present? Right. Ms. Faulkner, I know you gave a presentation, but is there anything you would like to chime in on for today's?
No, there is nothing additional. I do appreciate hearing all the different perspectives and the work that both you and Delegate Moon have put towards the proposal, but I don't have anything additional to share at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. next steps. The next steps, again, Delegate Moon and I were going to try to schedule some sort of meeting with the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. Claire will be putting together a draft report for this task force. I don't believe that there's necessarily a need for us to convene again at this point. So we'll have those conversations. I will tell you that one of the things that was on my mind that I'm contemplating is actually introducing another piece of legislation to possibly extend the date for our expiration, our termination, just to have some sort of an entity present to kind of watch what's this all unfold. Because as we have a conversation with the governor's office, I'm hoping that they may have some ideas on how to finance this sort of thing, and I think we may want to have some sort of an entity in place just to kind of see these steps along. So that's something that I'm contemplating, not necessarily anything for this body to act on outside of being if it were to be extended. I don't know how many of you all may want to continue or decide that this was enough. So just wanted to give y'all that fair warning. Anyhow, so yes, Ms. Warren, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, a question related to that, or maybe an observation. I noted in the helpful summary of recent law changes in other states relevant to this work that California's included the creation of a prosecutorial transparency advisory board. It seems like, you know, for similar purpose to the one that you articulated. So that caught my eye. And I do have one additional question, and I apologize if I missed this at the outset of the meeting, which I really lamented having to miss. But is the intention that the report, in addition to the listed recommendations, will include anything about the why? Because it seems like a lot of the debate that we've had as a task force and the sort of the different perspectives, like, why does this matter? Why, you know, why are we doing this? And will these recommendations achieve these stated goals? And it seems like maybe easier to get consensus on some of these high level recommendations than the why, but I was curious about whether or not there's going to be an attempt to articulate that.
What I would like, well, I guess what I envision is a report that captures a good bit of what we have been articulating and talking about. I think the why is an important part of that. So we'll have some conversations with our drafts person and trying to see how we can do some of that, because to submit, as we submitted to you all, just a list of proposed recommendations, I don't think really fully provides the flesh of the public to understand what it is that we're doing, and to your point, why it is that we're doing this and why this is important. So I would assume that would be a portion of the report. Would you agree, Delegate Moon?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a little bit of a delicate act trying to, like, we definitely want narrative content in here. And other reports I've seen of this nature, they usually will have something like the discussion reflects that some felt X or Y. So we can do a little bit of that, but I'd hate to take what the recommendations, which are fairly consensus, and make them seem not consensus through conflicting discussion. But I do think there's a room where the discussion itself does inform why we did this. So like I said, it'll be a little bit of an art trying to get that into the right state, but I think we're going to make an attempt.
Yeah.
Like, here's an example, you know, of a key issue that I think there may be differing opinions about where it fits within the why. Like we haven't talked much throughout these task force meetings about wrongful convictions, for example, and does greater data collection and transparency help illuminate, that problem and how to fix it? I mean, there's so many different examples that would go into the why. Or even today, there was sort of a fundamental back and forth or debate at one point about whether there's greater risk at quote unquote, sort of corrupting the goals of justice by collecting more information, or is the opposite, the greater risk. So I just wanted to note that I get that naming that and coming up with consensus around that is really hard, but it seems to me it's really fundamental to the work.
Understood. All right. So I would say that the next communication that you all would receive would be from Claire. If there is if we find that there's a need for one last meeting prior to the holidays, we'll do so, but I'll try not to do that to everyone. Delegate Moon and I, we have certainly appreciated the time and efforts that everyone has put into helping to illuminate this topic for us as well as the general public, and we hope to have a really good product to show the work that everyone put in. And with that said, if there are no more questions or comments from anyone, I do thank you and look forward to have a wonderful holiday and talk to you all very soon. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.